Today, we're going to talk about an accident involving the most popular aircraft in the world. An aircraft that carries approximately 1.5 million passengers every single day. A mysterious crash of the best-selling aircraft in aviation history. Was it the pilots or the plane itself? Have you ever wondered how an aircraft equipped with the most advanced technologies can suddenly fall from the sky like a rock in its final seconds? Was it the pilot's experience, sir? The complexity of the technology that caused such tragedies? Today, we'll dive deep into the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 that occurred in Amsterdam in 2009. This incident raised major questions about the Boeing 737, the most widely sold aircraft in aviation history. Was the problem with the aircraft or with the people flying it? Welcome to Airshock AI, where we investigate the real stories, technical causes, and human factors behind airplane crashes. In every episode, we take you to aviation's most critical moments, explore lessons learned from tragedies, and examine the safety improvements that followed. If you're interested in aviation safety and real events in the world of flight, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. On the morning of February 25, 2009, Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 from Istanbul to Amsterdam became the first aircraft in over a decade to crash at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. As the Boeing 737-800 was preparing to land, it plunged into a muddy field north of the airport and broke apart with a terrifying sound. The crash happened so close to the airport that rescue teams arrived at the scene immediately. While most passengers survived, many were severely injured. The survivors were rushed to nearby hospitals. Images of the Amsterdam crash quickly spread worldwide. It was the third passenger aircraft crash in just 6 weeks, and the sudden nature of the incident made it even more mysterious. The Dutch Safety Board, DSB, quickly arrived at the scene. However, since the aircraft was manufactured in the United States, the US, National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, also sent one of their most experienced investigators, Joe Sador, to Amsterdam. In international crashes, representatives from the country where the aircraft was built also participate in the investigation. The fuselage of Flight 1951 was split into 3 major sections, and the engines were found further ahead of the main wreckage site. Flight 1951 was a Boeing 737-800, one of the most advanced aircraft in the skies. It was designed to fly longer distances and at higher altitudes. Even Boeing employees referred to the next generation 737 as the best aircraft the company had ever produced. With upgraded wings, advanced avionics, and simpler systems, it required less maintenance than previous models. Investigators knew that this was no ordinary aircraft. The 737 is the world's best-selling commercial airplane. With more than 50 of them in the sky, carrying approximately 1.5 million passengers daily, it was crucial to find out why this plane crashed. If there was a defect in the aircraft, it needed to be identified quickly to prevent another similar accident. Initial data showed that Flight 1951 was traveling from Istanbul to Amsterdam. On this morning flight, there were 128 passengers, including 4 Boeing engineers. It was stated that no problems had been reported from the cockpit. The crash claimed the lives of 9 people, including 3 members of the Boeing team and the pilots in the cockpit. Interestingly, this crash bore eerie similarities to another recent accident involving a Boeing aircraft. British Airways Flight 38, which had crashed at Heathrow about a year earlier. In that incident, a Boeing 777 had dropped short of the runway just before landing. British Airways pilots had reported that both engines had stopped producing power just before touchdown. At the time of the Turkish Airlines crash, the exact cause of the Heathrow incident had still not been found. In both cases, investigators had plenty of clues to work with. The aircraft and its engines were largely intact. The flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, had been recovered in good condition. There were also many surviving passengers who could describe what had happened. According to them, the descent had been routine until the aircraft suddenly dropped from the sky and slammed into the ground. Perhaps the biggest clue came from the crash site. The debris had not spread over a large area. This indicated to investigators that the aircraft had not been moving at high speed upon impact. The pattern of wreckage and passenger reports led investigators to suspect the engines. There were no signs of fire in the fuselage. In many crashes, fuel in the plane's tanks ignites upon impact. The absence of fire raised a key question. Had the engine simply stopped working because Flight 1951 had run out of fuel? This was one of the first possibilities that came to mind. But the location and condition of the engines suggested they had not shut down during the flight. Because they were found far ahead of the main wreckage, it initially appeared they had been producing thrust at the time of impact. This was only a general assumption. Only the FDR could tell investigators how much power the engines were generating in the final seconds before the crash. Soon it was confirmed that there had been enough fuel in the tanks. Flight 1951 had definitely not run out of fuel. Passengers reported that in the seconds following the crash, the aircraft seemed to have fallen into something like turbulence. This led investigators to consider a known culprit, a microburst. A microburst is a powerful column of air that descends from thunderstorm clouds. It can slam an aircraft flying at low altitude straight into the ground. In 1985, a Delta Airlines flight encountered a microburst while landing at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, killing 137 people. Investigators found that there were heavy clouds over the airport at the time of the crash. These could have been accompanied by a strong gust of wind. The FDR would record wind speeds around the aircraft. To prove the microburst theory, investigators needed to analyze flight data. Meanwhile, the rescue efforts led to an unusual discovery. There were 3 pilots in the cockpit. This was odd, as it was a 2-person cockpit crew. So why was there a 3rd pilot present? Since none of the 3 pilots had survived the crash, it became even more urgent to retrieve information from the CVR. Fortunately, the way the plane had crashed had preserved access to the recorders in excellent condition. The reason for the 3rd pilot was soon discovered. For First Officer Murat Cesar, this flight was a type of training session. He had recently joined the airline and was learning the procedures for landing at Amsterdam Airport. Captain Hassan Arasan was performing a dual role, training the first officer while also commanding Flight 1951. Since he was conducting a lesson, a 3rd pilot, Olge Özgür, was present in the cockpit. He was the safety pilot, there to supervise the flight during this training mission. The CVR revealed that the 3 crew members began preparing for landing above 8,500 feet. However, the voice recorder picked up an unusual alert at this stage of the flight, something illogical for that altitude. A landing gear configuration warning. Captain Arasan repeatedly dismissed the alert. They were at 8,300 feet. The warning was a significant clue, but investigators still could not understand how it could have caused the crash. The crew of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 had received alerts to lower the landing gear while still thousands of feet above ground. In the initial CVR review, they had heard a landing gear warning while the aircraft was still near 10,000 feet. Investigators now turned to the FDR to resolve some of the mysteries surrounding this flight. The analysis of wind speeds around the plane was completed. It became clear that none were strong enough to force the aircraft down. But the FDR offered valuable insight into the cause of the landing gear warning. One of the altitude measuring instruments was mistakenly showing that the aircraft was already on the ground. The plane was equipped with two separate altimeters. One measured air pressure to determine altitude above sea level. The other was a radio altimeter. This device had 4 antennae transmitted signals to the ground and 2 received them to calculate altitude. It was highly accurate. In Flight 1951's case, the captain's side readings were incorrect for much of the flight. Captain Arasan appeared to understand that the landing gear warning was being triggered by a faulty radio altimeter. For most of the descent, the captain's radio altimeter showed a reading of 8 feet. This triggered the gear down warning. They treated it merely as an annoyance. As investigators looked for other irregularities, they found that while Flight 1951 was about 17 kilometers from the airport, air traffic controllers instructed the pilots to make their final turn to align with runway 18. Right. That turn brought Flight 1951 into line with the runway. The runway was equipped with an Instrument Landing System, ILS, which sends a signal defining the ideal descent path. The autopilot follows this glide path until the aircraft is a few hundred feet above the ground. Then, the pilot takes manual control. This generally makes the landing nearly effortless. According to international regulations, incoming aircraft are required to intercept the signal from below, guiding them to the runway. This prevents pilots from making sharp course corrections at the last moment. However, Flight 1951 was given instructions to intercept the glide path from above while still well above it. This is a standard practice at Schiphol, because it allows aircraft to land more quickly. Approaching a glide path from above is more difficult because the crew must suddenly slow the aircraft and descend quickly to capture the signal. This is known as a slam dunk approach. Some pilots like it, others do not. It's tricky. Everything happens faster when you're above the glide slope, and many pilots find it difficult. This approach increased the crew's workload, but it was standard procedure at Schiphol Airport. Although the aircraft picked up the ILS signal about 10 kilometers out, the alert tone signaling a malfunctioning system didn't concern the crew. Safety pilot Algay Özgür reminded Captain Arasan about the faulty radio altimeter. "We have a radio altimeter failure, sir." The captain confirmed and was cleared for landing. Investigators were puzzled. The crew was aware of the malfunction and continued the approach. So how did this lead to a crash? Clearly there was more to this accident than just a faulty altimeter. The foundation of aviation safety, how we build airplanes, how we fly them, is based on the assumption that a malfunction can occur. And yet, we should still be able to land safely. A radio altimeter is just a single device. If one fails, it should not cause a crash. Investigators examined whether the crew had properly aligned with the approach path. They carefully reviewed the conversations between the pilots and the air traffic controller. They double-checked every instruction. Following ATC directions, the crew made their final turn to the runway very close to the approach end. Flight 1951 had to descend from above the glide path. This increased workload, but again, it was standard practice at Schiphol. If the controller's instructions had overwhelmed the crew, it would have shown in their cockpit dialogue. The plane was now just 5 kilometers from the runway. The flight data illuminated the final minutes. The crew configured the plane for landing very late. Most airlines require all checklists to be completed by the time the aircraft reaches 1,000 feet altitude. In this case, the crew was still performing checklists at just 460 feet above ground moments before crisis began. This was an unstable approach. Because of this instability, the crew was under heavy workload during the final 1,000 feet of descent. The radio altimeter was faulty. The plane was issuing warnings. The crew was given a demanding approach. Their checklists were delayed, but none of this fully explained why Flight 1951 crashed. You can't get inside the pilots' heads in accidents like this, but the flight data recorder offered another important clue. Just moments before impact, both engines were at idle, delivering almost no thrust. Perhaps this was another Heathrow-style incident. Interestingly, the engines had been idling for the final 2 minutes of flight, right up until power was increased again. That was a massive red flag. The question was, why? Then investigators saw something very different from the Heathrow crash: flare mode. For some reason, while still more than 1,000 feet above the ground, the aircraft's computer began to prepare for landing. In retard flare mode, engine power is reduced to idle by the flight computer, and the nose automatically pitches up into flare position. Aircraft should only be in this configuration just before touchdown. The autopilot lifts the nose to soften the landing. The auto-throttle system pulls the power back to idle. But Flight 1951 slowed and entered nose-up attitude far too early, long before landing, causing it to fly slower and slower during the descent. So why was Flight 1951 in landing mode? And why didn't any of the 3 crew members notice how dangerously slow they were flying? The problem seemed to stem from the faulty radio altimeter. Investigators needed to look at the whole system, how that 8-foot reading affected other aircraft systems. That became a central focus of the investigation. They had to determine how the autopilot used that data, and more importantly, how the auto-throttle system used it. The airplane's flight control computer is made up of 2 main systems: the autopilot and the auto-throttle. The auto-throttle determines how much engine thrust is needed, while the autopilot controls altitude and direction. These systems operate independently. Only one radio altimeter feeds information to the auto-throttle. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together once the link between the faulty altimeter and engine power was identified. The radio altimeter on the captain's side was the sole data source for the auto-throttle, and it was malfunctioning. For most of the final approach, it was reading 8 feet. This faulty reading appeared to have triggered the chain of events leading to the crash. Investigators wanted to know what went wrong with it. On the 737, both radio altimeters used transmitter and receiver antennas mounted under the cockpit. 3 of these antennas were nearly destroyed in the crash and couldn't be tested. But one antenna on the captain's side was undamaged. Investigators considered 2 possibilities: a failed component or some form of interference causing the faulty reading. The only surviving component was tested. The computers managing the system were also functional. But investigators made an interesting discovery. These were not the original components installed when the plane was delivered to Turkish Airlines 7 years earlier. This shifted the focus of the investigation. When the maintenance logs were reviewed, investigators discovered a troubling history with the radio altimeter on this aircraft. Additional information from Turkish Airlines revealed that in approximately 150 of the last 1,000 flights, the aircraft had experienced radio altimeter malfunctions. Documentation showed that just over a year prior to the crash, both computers were replaced due to complaints about erroneous readings. One of those incidents involved 8 feet. So this showed that there was a recurring problem. The issue hadn't just occurred on this flight. Faulty readings continued. Mechanics had repeatedly replaced computers and antennas in attempts to resolve the problem. It was determined that Turkish Airlines had tried several methods to fix the radio altimeter. However, they hadn't found a repair that worked. At the time of the crash, Turkish Airlines operated 52 Boeing 737-800 series aircraft. When investigators reviewed the technical maintenance records, they discovered that both the crashed aircraft and others in the fleet had experienced multiple instances of radio altimeter problems. Investigators found that in the year before the crash, Turkish Airlines had dealt with 235 radio altimeter-related system faults in its 737s. The remedies included antenna replacements and swaps, system cleaning, computer replacements and swaps, and the installation of seals to protect the system from potential water damage. It wasn't that they did nothing. Turkish Airlines' maintenance team was well aware that radio altimeter failure was one of their top technical challenges. In fact, 16 altimeter-related repairs had been performed on the same aircraft that crashed in February 2009. But if the problem was so widespread, investigators wondered why hadn't it previously caused a serious incident. In truth, the same issue had occurred twice in the 48 hours leading up to the crash. The radio altimeter showed a negative reading and activated the retard flare mode. In both instances, the crew recognized the issue, disconnected the autothrottle, and safely landed the aircraft. You simply disconnect and manually control the plane. In the months after the crash, other operators reported similar experiences. In Australia, the Netherlands, Canada, and Austria, pilots had reported their 737s entering retard flare mode after the left radio altimeter gave incorrect readings. Each crew reacted the same way. They disconnected the autothrottle and manually re-engaged the power. All landed safely. A lot can go wrong in an aircraft, but most of the time you can detect it and land safely without danger. In 2008, Boeing received 569 reports of faulty radio altimeters in its latest 737s. However, in very few of those incidents did the plane actually enter retard flare mode. Almost none of the reports even mentioned it. Boeing also tried to investigate the issue but couldn't determine the root cause. They concluded that the radio altimeter problem was not a safety threat, as the 737 gave pilots enough warning to take corrective action. In fact, in every single case of altimeter failure, crews had recovered successfully. Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 seemed to be the only exception, and investigators still didn't know why. That's when we became truly curious about what happened and began to examine the actions of the flight crew very closely during the final approach below 10 feet. Eventually, when investigators reanalyzed the final minutes of Flight 1951, the conditions leading to the tragedy became clear. They saw a chain of rare events that combined to bring this plane down. So what exactly happened when the aircraft entered retard flare mode? They discovered that the aircraft switched to landing mode and cut the thrust at the worst possible time, just as the crew was trying to descend onto the glide path. This actually masked what was really happening. As the crew configured the aircraft to descend onto the glide path, they expected the plane to slow down as part of that process. But the aircraft was slowing down because it was already in landing mode, thanks to the faulty data. That's why none of the three pilots noticed the engines were idling. It was insidious. At first, while stuck in retard flare mode, the issue didn't cause any harm. They were still high and a bit fast, and the pilots actually wanted to reduce thrust. In fact, the engines may have already been idling while descending and decelerating. The problem started minutes before the crash, about 13 miles from the airport, at 300 feet. Could the crew have known that the auto-throttle would engage retard flare mode due to the faulty radio altimeter? No. This reflected a larger issue. The crew couldn't recognize the risk they were bringing into the flight. They had a faulty airplane. A small fault, yes, but one that, if not caught, could turn deadly. At 20 feet on the lower part of the glide path, the pilots needed to reduce their speed. Speed was 140 knots. They believed the engines were reducing power to help descend onto the glide path. In reality, the auto-throttle was slowing the plane because it had entered landing mode, and it would keep slowing until the plane stalled. We discovered that while the crew was going through the landing checklist, each of them should have been monitoring airspeed, but instead they were distracted. For the next 100 seconds, no one noticed what was happening until it was too late. The experienced captain realized the first officer had fallen slightly behind during the approach, so he called for flaps 40, moved the flap lever, and informed the first officer of his action. He was trying to help him catch up with the aircraft's descent. The aircraft was now just 700 feet above the ground. As they rushed to complete the checklist, none of the three crew members noticed the warnings about dangerously low airspeed. First, a red bar appeared on their flight display. Then, as the airspeed continued to drop, a flashing box appeared around the speed indicator to catch their attention. At this point, no one noticed these warnings. The aircraft was now at 600 feet. The changes in color were a visual cue that the plane was approaching dangerous limits. All of these signals were right in front of them, telling the crew the plane was slowing too much. Yet they were still focused on the checklist, and the ground was getting closer. In fact, they were less than 500 feet from touchdown. Just moments before the stall warning began, the pilots pushed the throttles to full power, but by then it was too late to recover. They were too low for the engines to spool up in time. That was it. It was already too late to save the aircraft. They all knew about the radio altimeter issue, but knowing wasn't enough. Boeing had not foreseen the lethal chain of events a faulty altimeter could trigger. But on February 25, 2009, that's exactly what happened. A rare and deadly combination of failures and oversights that brought a plane down and claimed 9 lives. The official report on the crash attributes it to a confluence of circumstances. An aircraft accident is never caused by a single reason. The Dutch report also notes that Boeing could have realized that the issue in the radio altimeter system might affect flight safety. Since no one had foreseen how this malfunction could lead to a crash, the Turkish Airlines accident raises a major question. Are airplanes becoming too complex? Investigators determined that Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 crashed mainly because the pilots failed to recognize the consequences of the warnings they received. This was not the first time an aircraft crashed because the crew did not understand what the airplane was telling them. Mika Ensley investigates the relationship between pilots and technology. She notes, "We haven't really designed automation to capitalize on what humans do well and eliminate what they don't." In 1996, the Aero Peru 757 crew crashed when they couldn't interpret conflicting altitude and airspeed warnings. The aircraft fell into the Pacific Ocean. 61 passengers and 9 crew members died. In 1000, 995, the flight management system of a Boeing 757 could have safely guided the aircraft to Cali, Colombia. However, a last-minute change to the flight plan required the crew to reprogram the computers. They mistakenly entered a course toward a 90-foot mountain. 159 people died in that crash. The cautionary tale here is that we can build equipment, these silicon-based devices, so complex that we cannot effectively communicate with them. And when they go haywire or are misprogrammed or malfunction, we put ourselves and our passengers in danger. NASA is working on a project called the Integrated Intelligent Flight Deck. It's aimed at helping humans use the technology around them in the cockpit more effectively. They're working on automated flight hand control systems and voice recognition systems. They've developed a new type of microphone using bone conduction chips. They are also developing new displays to help understand the surrounding environment and detect nearby aircraft. Some researchers have found that the best technology shouldn't replace pilots, it should work with them. Truly integrating people with technology means designing displays that help you understand what the system is doing and how to make it do what you want. It shouldn't take pressing 16 buttons in an 8-level menu just to understand what's going on. It should be integrated and presented in a clear, effective way. It should be as easy as communicating with the person sitting next to you. Boeing and Airbus, two largest commercial aircraft manufacturers, stake very different approaches to the relationship between humans and technology. Airbus gives a significant amount of decision-making authority in the cockpit to the flight computer. They believe this prevents many human errors. By ensuring the aircraft won't do something that could lead to an accident, even if the pilots try. But Boeing has a different philosophy. Boeing believes in providing more information to the pilots and letting them make the decisions. More information for the pilot is better. Airbus firmly and consistently argues that this view is outdated and wrong. The final report on the Turkish Airlines tragedy partly attributes the crash of Flight 1951 to a technological failure. Incorrect radio altimeter data caused the auto-throttle system to operate in the wrong mode. That is, of course, not a good situation. The root cause of the radio altimeter malfunction was never found. The Dutch investigation requested Boeing to improve the reliability of the system. We learned a lot about the radio altimeter system and how it affects the auto-throttle. Boeing is now working on system upgrades to ensure such an auto-throttle event doesn't happen again. However, the report also blames the crew, despite having 3 pilots on board, for failing to recognize the dangerously low airspeed. Forget about the auto-throttle. Look at airspeed and altitude. If needed, look out the damn window. But airspeed is the fundamental element for survival in an aircraft, and you must always know your speed. Yet for Mika Ensley, the crew not monitoring their instruments is entirely understandable, and it might be more the instrument's fault than the crew's. It is actually very hard for humans to monitor automation. One thing humans are not good at is monitoring. We're very good at real-time decision-making. We're very good at finding creative solutions to problems. But repetitive monitoring is something humans just aren't built for. That's why we need to design automation to work with humans in a more active, cognitively engaged way, not just in a passive monitoring relationship. The ultimate computer on board is still the pilot. The one who says, "I don't know what this thing is doing to me, but I'm turning it off and flying the airplane." Fly the plane. That's probably the smartest thing we learn in airline training. Fly the plane, do that first, or nothing else matters. And that's what they forgot. Did you find this investigation interesting? What aircraft accidents would you like us to cover next? Let us know in the comments.